Let's look at getting started with the data grid. The first thing you need to do if you're going to work with the data grid is add a reference to the assembly that contains it. So that is system.windows.controls.data. So add that in first. I've got a blank XAML page. This is really the result of file new project. We need to bring in an XML namespace if we're going to work with the controls from the data assembly. So we'll say XML and S, we'll call this data equals, and we go for system.windows.controls in the data assembly. That will then allow us to define ourselves a data grid. So we say data : data grid. And what I'm going to say on this in the first instance is I'm going to say item source equals binding. So that's data binding the items. And then we're going to say auto generate columns equals true. So it's kind of the minimum that we can do, I guess, to get going with this control. So now I need to provide some kind of data for this to bind to. I've already got in my project over here a little bunch of code. I have this class called person. Person implements iNotify property changed, and you might have seen that if you looked at the video we did on simple data binding. And it just has properties called first name, last name, age, and male, which means really gender. And we fire property change notifications whenever you set the value of these things, just to make this work with data binding in Silverlight. We also have this method called getTestList, and this returns an observable collection of person. So we'll come back and talk about observable collection a bit later. Basically it's a collection of people, and you can see that I've just hard-coded some people in here. So we create a new person, we have Fred, Jim, and Sue, and they've got some ages, and we just return that. So it's just a bit of test data that I can use, this test list. So what that means is you can go back to our code behind our XAML over here, and let's just go and say what we'll do when the page loads. We'll just say this.loaded plus equals onloaded, and we'll have that call, and in that call we'll just go and say to ourselves, we'll set up the data context to be person.getTestList. So we're just binding that to the data context of the page, which will then be picked up by the data grid that lives below it. So let's go press F5 and see what happens. Let's just switch on debugging. Okay, and we can see straight away that we've got a grid on the screen, and the grid is displaying our data. So this is pretty cool. We did no work, but we got the columns on there, we got the data in there. It's all working the way we'd expect. And if we were to pop back to Visual Studio and go to that class I was just showing you, people, or person as it's called, let's say if we take the last name here and stick a breakpoint in the setter, we go back to our grid and we say change the last name of this person here to be Johnson or something like that, tab away, you'll see that we're getting changes reflected from the grid straight into our code again without having to do any work in order to make that happen. If we were to look at that the other way around, let's go and add some button onto this UI that we can use to change something in code. So let's go back to the code and visit the XAML that we've got, and what we'll do is just put some rows into our grid. So we'll have grid.row definitions, grid.row definitions, and we'll add a couple of row definitions in there. Let's add a second one, and we'll just add a button at the bottom of this UI. Grid.row will equal 1. We'll put a little bit of a margin around it, and we'll just say content equals changes or something like that, and click equals on click. So just adding a button onto the UI, hopefully down there at the bottom. It's a little bit big actually, so what we'll do is just set an explicit height on it of 24 or something like that, just so we can see it doesn't look too bad. And we'll just set the height of that row to be auto so that it reflects that. That's a bit better. Okay, cool. So we've got our button. Let's go to the code again behind this and let's write an event handler for click. And what we'll do in here is let's just go through all of the data-bound data that we've got. Now I could go and grab that back out of the data context, but I'm actually thinking that maybe I should have kept the observable collection of person around. So just keep a reference to that. Let's call that data, and then here what we'll say is, excuse me, let's just let that collapse. We'll say data equals this, and we'll say this.data context equals data. So really I'm just keeping this around in a member variable so that we can use it again here. And what we'll say is for each person, P, in data, let's go and say p.lastname equals modified. Let's press F5. And so what we're trying to show is that if we modify something in the data model behind the grid should update itself. Let's just take away that breakpoint. And let's see if we click on changes, the grid is syncing itself to those changes. So we've got two-way data binding without us having to do any work whatsoever. Just look at another thing here. Imagine that our code didn't go and change the last names of these people. Let's imagine that what it did was take the data and say remove, let's say remove at 0 to remove the first element in the list. So let's press F5 again. And if we go back into the grid and click our button, we should see that our list of people is now shrinking down until there's nothing left in it. Now, the reason that that works is because we used an observable collection in the first place. That wouldn't have worked if we used something like a list. So observable collection implements the right change notification interfaces for a collection in order that something like the DataGrid here can bind to it. So it's a useful class to be aware of for data binding to things like DataGrids and list boxes and so on, because it just knows how to fire the right change notification events. So far we've allowed the grid to generate everything for us. Let's move away from that a little bit. Let's tell it to no longer generate columns for us, and that means we're going to have to do a little bit more work in our XAML. So what we'll do here is we'll say that data, let's go and set up what the columns look like for this grid, and we've got different choices of DataGrid columns that we can use. So you can see we've got things like a text column, a template column, and we've got a checkbox column. So first off, we want to represent our first name, last name, and so on. So let's use text boxes for those. So we'll say we'll have a text column. And that text column, what we're going to do is data bind it. So we'll say display member binding equals binding to, and what are we trying to bind to here? Well, first name is what we're trying to bind to. And let's go and say that the header on this equals first name. Let's copy that and kind of duplicate it for last name. So we'll also have last name there, and we'll have last name there. Let's duplicate it again a little bit with another text box for age, and let's set that to age. Maybe we want to have age to be read only. So let's say you can only read the value of age, you can't modify it. And then we've got that gender sort of flag. So let's say data, and what we want there is a checkbox column. Let's just go and throw that in. A checkbox column. Header is going to be male. Let's put a question mark on there. And what we want to do with that is display member binding equals binding to male is I think what we called the data. And let's just go and close off that. So we're now generating our own columns using text column and a checkbox column in this case. So let's go press F5 on that and see if we manage to get that right. And so here we are, it looks pretty good. You might notice that I can no longer edit the age, whereas I can edit the last name. Let's set that to foo or something like that. And that's working fine, but age is now read only. We got our own headers and everything's all set up the way we set it up. Now, not everything in the world is a text box or a checkbox, and so we have another way of doing this which is more flexible. Instead of using first name here with a text column, let's go ahead and use what we call a, let me just find this guy, it's a template column. So we have a template column here, and so we'll not use this the way we were using it. We'll have our first column here to be a template column. Once again, let's put a header on this of first name. This is now templated, and inside of there what we want to do is we want to set the DataGrid column dot, and we want to set the cell template. That is going to be a data template, and into that data template I'm going to put a text block, and into there we'll say text equals binding, and our binding is to first name. Okay, let's do that. So we have that bound to first name now. Let's go and press F5. And we can see that this is still bound to first name, it's still displaying correctly. You might notice it's currently read only. So what benefit do we get from this? Well, we'll come back to the read only thing in a second. Inside of this data template we can put whatever we want. So if we want to put a grid in here, and inside that grid we maybe want to have our text block, but maybe we also want to have I don't know, a rectangle or something. Let's say fill equals red, and let's have an ellipse. Let's say fill equals yellow, and let's just say margin equals 2 or something like that, just to space it out a little bit. Let's make sure that our text alignment is a center on this. Let's go press F5. The point is that because we're using a templated column, we can put whatever we like inside of that particular row. So if we want a video in there, if we want some kind of image in there, we can put whatever we want inside there because they're templated. So that's pretty cool. I noticed as well while we were there that the vertical alignment was out, so let's just set that to center whilst we're there on the text block. But at the moment this is read-only, which is not so hot. If we want it to be read-write, we can also add to this thing a data grid template column dot cell editing template. Let's put into there a simple text box, and on that text box let's say text equals binding to first name and mode equals two-way, and then we should be able to go and rerun. So now we have a cell template and a cell editing template. I'm just noticing that I forgot to put a data template in there, so that's criminal. Let's put a data template in there and move the text box into that data template. That's going to be a lot happier. And let's press F5 and see if we can spin that back up. And then as we double click on one of these, we can now get a text box, and we change this to Jane or something, and that's now working the way you expect. So hopefully you can see how powerful this templating approach is in a grid like this, because we can really do kind of whatever we want in there. So hopefully that gives you an intro as to how we get on with the grid. We get it onto a form. We can then start to data bind it. We can take control over the columns that are generated if we don't like the generated approach. We can do different templates. We've got the text box, the checkbox, and then we've got the templated column to take full flexibility. There are many, many things that we can do with this grid control. It has lots of events. It has lots of templates that we can alter. We'll come back and take a look at some more of these aspects of it in future videos. Hopefully we can keep this video short and just get you started with using it.